Hey, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Today, we're excited to welcome Tim Herbig. Tim is a product and product leadership coach out of Europe, and he has a special focus on OKRs. His perspective is so unique, and I'm really excited for the conversation today. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me, Cassie.
My pleasure. Um, I can't imagine how many people have Googled how do I do OKRs better? and perhaps have come across your content. But before we jump into that, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your journey, your path, and how you became a coach.
Sure, happy to do that. So, in general, I stumbled into product management, I think back in 2010. Like the company I worked at back in the day was like, hey, we're going to do Scrum for this internal tool, and you're going to be the product owner. And that's exactly how well it went, meaning not that well. Like nobody had an idea of what to do. Like I just filled out Word templates of user stories and tried to tell senior developers what to do. So that didn't really work that well. And I thought this whole Scrum thing is just a hoax. It's like you can't be real about that. And so I left that behind. I moved to a couple of larger companies after that in Germany, working in media, and it's a couple of smaller startups as well. I had the pleasure of working at Germany's LinkedIn, which is called Zing, which is was one of the biggest and most mature product management places of all time
Mm.
in Germany until that. They even had Marty Kagan act as an interim VP of product for 6 months or so. So you can really see
Oh,
like this
wow.
place was really
Yeah.
like mature already, and like lots of practices were picked up. And when I left there in 2016, I wanted to join a smaller startup, which turned into a bit of a boutique consultancy. And so that was my first like hooray into, okay, like now I don't just work with other product professionals. Now I have to think about how do I help others improve the product craft essentially. So that was an interesting experience, and I noticed that I really liked the fundamental idea of picking what I knew and thinking about how do I repackage that. So working at this intersection of education and coaching, and both like how do I orchestrate these two building blocks? Because
Mm.
on the one hand, I need to help people to improve their knowledge so that they can ask better questions and challenge me, and I can help them elevate through coaching. And so that was an interesting experience. I loved it a lot. I didn't like working in the consultancy, I will say that. I didn't like trying to find billable hours in the sales portion of that. But I always, yeah, I love the feeling. And thankfully, even after I left that, former clients reached out to me like, hey, could you work with us again? So I did 2 more years of working in B2B because I always wanted to do B2B. And then in 2019, I finally went independent and started to work as a product management coach as the main label. And yeah, ever since then, I have the privilege of working with a couple of very ambitious, interesting companies across the globe, as you mentioned, across the themes of OKRs, also product discovery, product strategy, and helping teams basically improve their craft along the lines of these domains through coaching, training, speaking formats.
Wow, I love that story. And we have had a couple of other consultants also on this series. And there is a Venn diagram there, right? Of whether you're doing the work for somebody, but also if you're in the boat with them rowing along and having an opportunity to
Right.
help share and help them up level their practice too.
Yeah.
Um, Great. And so how did you get into well, there is a deep body of work you have on OKRs. I highly recommend everybody go check that out. And we'll put the resources in the show notes. But it sounds like you have a bit of a unique angle on things. And so I'd just really be curious, like, first of all, I guess, do you feel that it is unique potentially in the market? And where did that come from?
So I like to think that it is unique as well. Like the running joke that I have is that ever since I started Go Independent, like people keep asking me, now they don't no longer ask me, but in the beginning people asked me, don't you miss working on the product? And I'm just saying, you know what, I really don't because I see my business and myself as the product. Like so I
Hmm.
try to I ask the same question about myself, about my services, like the same questions you ask for a product strategy. Who is my audience? The problem that I have? How do they have? How do I differentiate from others? What do I want to offer? And so the the topics I landed on kind of naturally got to me. Like I think I've been more exposed to product discovery work since 2013, 2014 from my work. think I first got to know OKRs first time 2015, 2016, something like that. Then I read Christina Watkey's fabulous book, Radical Focus, and it really clicked for me. Then I experimented with OKRs in-house more and realized how much difference there is between the general do it like Google OKR advice and the nuances of doing it in a product management context. And
Hmm.
so that really clicked with people as well. And so that and the positive resonance reinforced this idea I had. Okay, I don't do OKRs, I do OKRs for product managers, for product management. And they also point out how these things play together. And every time when I tried content formats, which is part of my work as well as like I've been writing my newsletter for many, many years, where I always test like which kind of formats resonate. And the best formats that resonate is whenever I connect well-known practices to a different context. So people
Hmm.
love that. And so that reinforces this fundamental idea for me. I don't need to reinvent the wheel, try to think of a new goal setting framework or whatever. I want to focus on making something like OKRs as accessible as possible for people working in different contexts, whether that's the whole
Hmm.
B2C, B2B thing, that whether that's internal platform teams, like all those different contexts, these practices should be more practiced really. And so because I don't want to spread myself too thin, I settled on these three things, OKR, strategy, discovery, because I think they play really nicely together. And so that's how I landed on them. So it's this mix of what if I feel like I'm naturally good at or what comes relatively easy
Yeah,
to me, positive market feedback, and then just sticking to that and building that further out.
that's amazing. You mentioned Google OKRs. What do you think the main differences between how Google might do OKRs at large and how
Yeah.
you think product leaders in a product context, which is so unique, can leverage that construct, but in their context?
I think I think first of all, one of the things is that not every company does work that is as ambitious as Google's work in the early days, right? I
Mm,
think what goes around a lot of times is like John Doerr's book on like measure what matters. And then in there, there's I think the Google Chrome examples and everything. It's like these numbers just are not applicable to 99% of companies. So
mhm,
working with these kind of metrics, like setting the metric and even working towards that is just not the reality of many companies. And I think what they then fail to see is that OKRs, I think, like what's the point of setting OKRs in the first place? And I think that there's so much more than quote unquote just the giant moonshots, right? It's more like, okay, like how can is that is essentially it's one format to measure the progress and success of your work to do that. And to you can achieve different changes with that, right? You can say, I want to use OKRs to focus on performance, I want to focus more on outcomes. You have this you can turn up these dials of what you want to achieve with OKRs. It's not just this one correct way of doing them, of using them.
mhm.
What I see instead is like people critique this Google way of using OKRs and then they propose a different goal framework. And I personally rather think, why don't you modify OKRs? Like there's no patent OKR university that tells you that's wrong and not allowed to do that. Like adapt the practice to what you need really. And so I think that's something that has been lost for a bit, and which I think I try to do my share in like helping people remind them that's possible. So I think it's the coming back to your questions, the general like this big crazy moonshot thinking, and 70% is the real 100%. And I've just seen like firsthand how that can demotivate people. Like this whole 70%, 100% thing of like, why don't you set realistic, like achievable goals and say 100% is
Yeah,
100%. Make them ambitious, but why play this weird game? Because then people just trick the system. They just start to
right,
sandbag the goals. So it's like,
right.
what's the point, right? Yes, it worked.
Yeah,
The point is like it worked great for Google in that context, and I think that's the part of the story that has to be remembered. It's like that is a snapshot of how this practice in this particular way worked for this particular company at that particular time, and that's great. I don't want to take anything away from the success they had. And yet, the question is, what's your snapshot? What's your context? What's your context for
right.
using OKRs and taking that into consideration? Maybe it's the Google way, but more likely than not, it's an adjusted version of that.
Mm. And that's really interesting because I think that does probably make people's heart skip a beat, right? To say, okay, so I'm gonna set a goal. It's gonna be really ambitious, but I'll call it green if I got to 70% of the goal.
Yeah.
It adds a layer of complexity. to something that
Exactly.
might already require a significant amount of change management, to use a fancy word, I guess, in an organization.
Yeah.
What are some other ways you've seen people adopt or adapt it really in the context of, well, first of all, I guess for product versus at large, maybe does it have to do with different stages of a product life cycle? Are you in a just like what would OKRs look like if you are really in the research and discovery phase, for example?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think the tricky bit is, and I think there's a great quote from Ravi Mehta that I always like to use, which is he said, the goal, the goal for a team has to fit the type of risk or the type of stage they're at, which is the type of risk
Hmm.
they're facing. And I think I really love that, which is that if your biggest risk is, can I reduce uncertainty around the problem space, for example, in a new vertical, new industry I want to go after, then it's weird to put your goal as like customer adoption. It's like, but that's too far removed from the work that you're doing for the next couple of weeks or even months. So I'm always advocating what's the point of setting a goal that you know won't change for 3, 4, 5 months because you can't check in on the goal. You will never see progress. It will always be zero. So what's the point of setting it as a goal? You can have it as an ambition, as an objective or mission, whatever, but not as a measurable progress. So then the question becomes, okay, what can we do? There are things like I think I've seen a couple of different variations. I mean, the most blunt one is, of course, the number of experiments, number of interviews. There's a pro and con to that. I think for some teams, it might be just like, yeah, you just have to do the work, and maybe that kind of goal can help you do the work and hold you accountable. Obviously, it has its downsides. You can do very shitty interviews, and so it doesn't necessarily mean progress.
Hmm.
I think a nice one that I've heard of is like learning cycle, like measuring the learning cycle essentially, like how much time is in between customer interactions, for example, right? I think that's a
Hmm.
good one, like just to measure the cadence, that the cadence stays high to establish a practice. Another
Can you
one that I
explain that one a little
really,
bit more? Yeah.
it's like as a cadence, as in like how many or weeks with, let's say weeks with a number of customer interactions or
Hmm.
um, customer interactions that were not preceded by more than 3 days by another interaction or something like that. Like
Hmm.
that could be like one kind of measurement to do that. Again,
Hmm.
it also has its downsides of measuring it that way. It's one way. One thing that I've heard from a team, which is again, well, I would say that the big constraint is the less of a live product that you have, the less of an outcome your goal can represent, essentially, right? Because you can't measure the outcome
Hmm.
yet of the customer. You can measure your own outcomes, like how do the behavior of the teams change in that phase? Again, how do we doing the work? Like one thing that I once heard from a team I worked with was that they set for themselves, set themselves their own confidence score, essentially. So they defined internal criteria about when does our confidence go up or down in something that is determined by the experiments and the
Oh, I
research work
love
they were
that.
doing. And then I think the threshold then became something like um, share of ideas committed for delivery with a confidence score above XYZ, something like that. Again, and that's like sometimes in these situations, you have to create your own measurements. You can't just pick from the broad variety of metrics that exist on the internet to use for key results because they just don't work in your context. So I think
Hmm.
something along the lines of that, again, you have this output outcome spectrum and think about, okay, which metric just matches the risk that we're having. I
Hmm.
also have the conversation with teams when a team is in a space or in a situation where they just can't have an outcome goal. So for example, let's say a migration or something like that, where it's clear you can't have an outcome goal because it's only about doing the work, it's about the output, then I always say it's totally fair to say maybe OKRs are just not suited for that period of your work. That's perfectly
Hmm.
fine. If you feel like you have to set goals, be realistic and set goals you can actually measure continuously rather than having like NPS in 2 years when the migration is
Hmm.
done, which I think
Hmm.
serves little the value.
Okay. Um, Super valuable. My mind is creating boxes and arrows and inside the vision of it. So I feel like
Yeah.
what we've talked about are like three different kinds of goals, right? One being in the discovery phase when there's high ambiguity and setting a a goal that's very like business outcome oriented is high
Yeah.
risk because there's a significant amount of what's happening that's not under control, right? Of
Yeah.
the product person, right? So that would be the like I'll call it discovery phase for now. And then the next
Yeah.
box is really okay, standard goals, right? Like I want to increase retention by 7%, right?
Exactly.
Whatever,
Yeah.
something where you can reverse engineer and come up with the
Yeah.
concepts that could help deliver on the execution of that goal in a pretty straightforward manner. And then something that feels black and white, like delivery, like
Yeah.
migration of from a legacy system to a new system. Um, can like with those three in mind, you're saying that for the discovery goal that you're saying, like adapt it to your needs. Don't set a goal for something that you can't control, like
Or at least not, I
necessarily.
would say maybe at least not influence, right? I'm a big fan of
Yeah,
this concept from, I think, William Detner, the sphere of influence idea. And I think
yeah,
that's such a fascinating, that's such a, one of my favorite exercises in the context of OKRs, because honestly, most of my experience is, most of the work I do with teams is not so much about OKRs, it's about thinking in metrics and sphere of influence. And then you can translate it to the format of OKRs, right? I
yeah,
don't want people to get too caught up in now write key results. Instead, I
yeah.
tell them, how do you measure success? Just tell me how you measure success.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sphere of influence idea is so fascinating because it reveals like how little people can maybe actually influence or how much they can influence. And I think that's such a
Ah,
good basis. If you realize that if 80% of your OKRs sit outside of your sphere of influence, how how should these OKRs be valuable to you to measure your work? Like they can't. And
yeah.
then you have to think about, okay, what kind of other goals can I draw from? Or what has to change about my team's capabilities? Or how can I expand my team's sphere of influence so that my OKRs are more useful to the work that I'm doing?
Mhm. And then would you do something like, oh, I can create a customer advisory board with key influencers in that space and make that an OKR to expand your influence? Like, would that be
I
kind
think
of a path of that, going down that path?
I probably have to think that through. So I think the way I rather look at it is I have teams, so I give people these three areas. And so I call this, I think the core concept from Detmer is sphere of influence, zone of control, and I've expanded that to, I think there's also an area of contribution layer. So I think area of
Mm,
contribution is typically where you have like your business goals, for example, like the things you're contributing, but which depend on so many contributing factors that you can't directly tie them to your work. Then you have influence, which is typically customer outcomes. Like you can influence customer outcomes or your or
mm,
team outcomes or stakeholder outcomes, but you can't control them, right? You can't control how people's behaviors change. And
mhm,
then what's the stuff you can control? And typically what you can control is only the outputs, like the artifacts you create, or the inputs, like the work that you do, like the amount of hours you put in.
mhm,
And so coming from that, I would probably say, okay, um, to your point, it could be say, okay, like if I don't like, let's say people realize I don't have insight into how my customers think about my product because I'm an enterprise product, I don't have analytics, whatever, I can't measure customer behavior. You could say, okay, how can we then? It's not quantitative. How can we get more qualitative insights? So maybe then saying we establish like a qualitative data point among our customers, maybe through a customer advisory board could become something we can influence, right? We now
mhm,
establish a new metric in our sphere of influence. So I
mhm,
think it's more about thinking about what, even independent of OKRs, like what sits in those three buckets of contribution, influence, control, and then think about how
mhm,
can I measure it? And then you realize, okay, customer satisfaction or customer behavior, how could I measure that? Today I maybe can't, but maybe I can establish a new measurement I can influence to measure it. And then you can draw from that for articulating your OKRs.
mhm. That's really interesting. Um, I'm gonna put that in the resources and also be looking that one up for my own bookshelf. Okay, so we were talking about discovery, talk about standard OKRs, which I don't think we'll go deep into that, or not standard OKRs, but measurable things like
Yeah,
retention or churn or things that feel like very tangible, especially to, for example, the CFO, right? If you're working with somebody like that. And
yeah,
then the more delivery slash output oriented ones like a migration. Can you
right,
expand on why something like that may not be a great fit for OKR?
right. So if you think of your standard migration, right? Let's say you're migrating from an on-premise system to AWS, for example, right?
Yeah.
The question that might be, okay, so what are we, you can ask the question, what do we want to get out of migrating to AWS? And you might have something like reduce the server cost, improve uptime, and maybe increase reduce the time to deploy, right? Basically, probably like cost, quality, and speed up for the team. These might be reasons to
Hmm.
move to the cloud. And the problem is that all of these three metrics, if we turn these into metrics, right, it's like uptime, hosting costs, and time to deploy, all of these three metrics there's a chance that all of these metrics will only start to really change once you've completed the migration. Depending on how you do it, how gradual, how continuously you're doing
Uh,
it, right? So if we take the number of monthly hosting bill, right, and you realize, okay, we can't do it partially, we have to do it all at once. Like we can only switch it on once we have actually shifted everything. Then the metric reduce monthly hosting bill will stay at 0% progress if you set that as a target for like the entirety of the migration. It won't change until you flip the switch. And then once you flip the switch, it will go down. So
okay.
then this metric is not that usable during the migration, right? It doesn't help you measure your progress. But the only thing that will give you ideas about your progress is how many services have been made available to production for the new cloud setup. How many
Hmm.
requirements have we approved? Whatever. Like these kind of
Hmm.
very outputty metrics. And
Hmm.
then I think the question is fair, and that's for the teams I've met. It's like the question is fair. Look, these output metrics, we're tracking them in Jira and our project sheet, whatever you're using. Why do we need to have these replicated in OKRs as well? It's a fair point, right? And that's why I'm
Hmm.
always saying it might not be useful to have them in the OKRs. Some companies insist on no, they need to be in the OKRs. And then I'm like, okay, but all you can put in there are these kind of things. And
Yeah.
then that's that. But I think there's a legitimate point to say you don't need OKRs per se for migration like that.
Got it. So then by that this description, well formatted and useful OKR is one where you can be watching the overtime progression so
Yeah,
that you can course correct
exactly.
at some
Yeah,
period of time. So it
yeah,
wouldn't be the end result. It might be how many tables have we transformed into the new data format
yeah,
needed for the
yeah.
migration or something like that. Okay. That's really interesting. Well, so then speaking of OKRs and then the CFO, right, other stakeholders, how how do you help people then if they're thinking about doing OKRs a little bit differently in product? Are most of the people that you're working with using OKRs in the context of a broader company also using OKRs and therefore needing to, for example, create influence with a CFO or some other stakeholder that might be doing it in a different way?
So I'm in and of course you can add all sorts of bias here because most of the clients that I work like come to me for the reason for a certain reason or pick me for a certain reason.
Hmm.
So the situation that I most commonly come into is that a company has decided to work with OKRs, maybe has been working with OKRs for a couple of cycles or years already, maybe in one department or has expanded as well. And the product team just feels that the by the book way of doing OKRs for the rest of the company, for let's say more non-agile ways of working, works well, but it doesn't really align with those other practices that they have. It doesn't align with delivery cycles, with product strategy, with discovery efforts. It just really doesn't line up with that. And so that's typically the situation that I meet. And so for me, it's thankfully it's less about convincing someone like the CFO about that. It's more like because the product managers did that already, or the head of product or the CPO, because they're like, look, we need to improve this practice. This is like inefficient. We're having separate OKR meetings or whatever OKR check-ins. It just doesn't work for us that way. We want to improve the way we do OKRs. And then I get to work with the product management organization or several product teams to think about how can they, what modifications would help them improve the way they use OKRs.
And then are you commonly mixing that, excuse me, commonly mixing that with the strategy work and the discovery work as well? Is there a sequence that happens there, or do you see them all happening in concert? And is this more of a cycle? How
Yeah.
do you think about those things?
So it's never a clear sequence. For me, it's typically the case that one of my three topics is the leading argument for starting to work with me. And as we're working, we either explicitly or implicitly will touch on these other topics as well. They will come up as well. Sometimes they just stay as part of the topic in a workshop or a coaching session, or sometimes they become more formalized of like thinking about a more structured education around that. So that is possible, but typically it doesn't follow a clear sequence. But inevitably, it will always come up in some shape or form, right? Because I think we touched on that already. Like the when you do discovery work, you will talk about the OKRs a team has, right? Inevitably,
Hmm.
this will come up, and so you have to think about what does that mean together. When a team
Hmm.
sets OKRs, I mean, the literal point of OKRs is to translate strategy into measurable goals. So inevitably,
Hmm.
strategy will come up.
Hmm.
When people want to put customer outcomes in their OKRs, outcomes should be based on problems. Inevitably, discovery comes up. So naturally, like let's say those other practices just emerge and show themselves, and then it's a question of the mandate that I have. Like, do we wander into this territory or just do we leave it here? But I try my best to at least point out the relationship. Like, I think a lot of like one of my core thesis is that, like, let's say OKRs, like a big portion of OKR issues companies have do not necessarily have to do with the OKR practice itself, but like some of these adjacent practices. Like, the better your strategy is, the more clear your OKR setting will be. The better your discovery is, the easier discover OKR setting is. And so I think there are these natural synergies where when you're stuck with one practice, turning to one of those other domains is the actual relief that you need, and not just trying to do OKRs harder, but rather turning to your strategy to make sure your OKRs flow more easily.
Hmm. And then I could imagine, and I think you mentioned this earlier, right? You said this concept of confidence is an interesting one to measure. And for example, we say sometimes that product strategy and business strategy is a series of bets that you're taking that are as informed as they can be based on what you've been able to see in the marketplace. But that because there is inevitably some component there that's not directly within your control, it's a hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
And so that is really interesting to see. Like, could the strategic bet and how those are being, hopefully, diverge, converge, and to create some significant focus, and then that trickles down through your OKR process. Um, I'd love to think more about like how could that does confidence potentially play a larger role in some of that on the strategy side?
I think so. I think the question that I commonly get to is that, I mean, the problem, not the problem, like the nature of strategy is like nobody knows if they're right from the get-go anyways, right? So nobody knows. You can be more or less certain based on evidence and surroundings that you have and the hunches that you have. And I encourage teams that I get to work with, like because I think the way I think about product strategy is that it's like basically a connected set of a lot of different individual components, like target
Hmm.
audiences, problems, differentiators, all the normal stuff. And I think to be clear and transparent about which of these components am I very certain of that that's the case, like that is the target audience we go after, or that is the problem that they have, and which parts are more of a well, like a big assumption. Like here's how we think the value proposition has to look like. Here's how we think we're going to differentiate. And because these things are then the biggest risks or areas of uncertainty in your strategy, which surprise should then inform your discovery work and vice versa. So I think this acknowledgement of, let's say, confidence or certainty, whatever word you want to use for the different aspects of your strategies is something important. I think it's never the whole strategy. It's like a part of the strategy where you're most uncertain about. It's like that is here's the risk. Like the risk is in the segment or the value proposition or whatever other component. So I definitely see
Hmm.
that being a part of that.
Hmm. That's interesting. Sometimes you might hear, or one might hear, that people feel OKRs are overkill in terms of overhead, and for maybe someone might say like a really early stage startup versus
Right.
a larger enterprise organization, right? You might hear an early startup founder say, well, that was good for Google, but Google's huge. And I've got my crew of 5 people here, and we just we figure it out as we go.
Right.
Um, what is your take on that?
So my take on that is that in general, I agree that of course the smaller you are, the less process or structure you need to structure your work, right? But I think that what's commonly misunderstood about OKRs is that OKRs is one way to utilize metrics to measure your progress. Like that's how I really boil it down. And you can determine how you want that to look like. Because I
Hmm.
think as I said in the beginning, when I work with teams on writing OKRs, I don't sit down with them and ask them, what are your key results? I ask them more natural sounding things.
Mm.
What are you doing differently next quarter? Which metrics will tell you that you succeeded with doing that thing?
Hmm.
And frankly, I think these are questions even early stage startups should ask
Hmm.
themselves. I was like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing next quarter? Like, what are we planning to do? What are we attempting to do? How do we measure success? Again, this is like a normal question. And then you can
Hmm.
just translate that into a format like OKRs to do that. And you want to check in on it every week or every 2 weeks to see are we doing, are we measuring, are we coming along? And
Hmm.
the scale of how you're doing that at a larger company just requires more orchestration, more alignment between teams, maybe different tooling. But I think you can size and change that as you want, right? Because I think again, if the argument is we're not measuring success, even early stage startup, I'm like, okay, that's a different conversation. There's nothing to do with OKRs. So I
Hmm.
think people forget that they own their practice. Like they can shape their practice.
That's really helpful because I do feel like there's often when I've seen people leverage them, they are uh, really looking towards the templates that are out there and leveraging them in a bit of a paint
Yeah,
by numbers way. Yeah.
yeah,
And
I
so
get
this
that. Yeah,
this
yeah, I
this
get that.
concept of tuning is really helpful. And I think there
Yeah,
was another one that I had read an article that you wrote about the narrative commitments and tasks, right? Like as another
yeah,
comparison,
yeah.
which is a very fun
Ravi's
experience. Yeah,
approach.
Ravi's.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you share a little bit more about, what he was trying to solve
yeah,
with that and how you think, because I think it's a really illuminating concept. Like, oh, let me think about how to adapt this to
yeah,
my context. And that's a really great example, I think.
yeah. And I have to admit, like it's been a bit since I actually read Ravi's article, so I might get some of
Yeah.
these facts wrong. But like I
Okay.
was very open with him in my article, so it's all good. Like the way I see it is the I think that the points of criticism he lays out in this article towards OKRs are very valid,
Yeah.
but they are valid for one specific way of using OKRs. And so I think if you would say this is the only way to use OKRs, then I would agree, yes, like using some of the approaches he says improves things. My counter argument was you can modify OKRs to do all of these things as well. Like
Hmm.
you don't have to call it something different. I would agree that I think a narrative is important. I think what he said is you don't want to have like very nitty-gritty I think metrics. You want to be able to link your goals to something overarching, right? Which I totally agree. But I think
Hmm.
that's why your OKRs need to have a clear link to your strategy, and this should have a
Hmm.
link to your vision. So I think, yeah, you need to have that. Um, when it comes to the tasks part that he has, I think that's oftentimes underestimated in OKRs, is the real work happens after you set the OKRs. Because then you have to think
Hmm.
about, you basically have to ask yourself the very broad scale, how might we question? Like these are the OKRs, how might we achieve them? Like what will we do about them? And then use the OKRs to prioritize your work, prioritize your tasks, and then
Hmm.
connect the work that you're doing to your OKRs. I think that's so underrated. Like that's the real value, that you want to hold the work that you're doing against your OKRs to
Hmm.
see if you're doing on the right things. I can't really remember the exact content
Commitment.
he put
So,
out on the commitments
yeah.
part. I'm not
Yeah.
really sure what the concept was that he laid out. Um, but I think it was something along the lines of that, like the whole check-in thing. Like you have to be able to check in things. I think he refers
Yeah.
to if you have those lagging goals that you can only measure in hindsight and you can't really keep your commitment. And my counter argument is, well, that's why you need leading goals that you can measure along the way to keep the
Yeah.
commitment high, to check in, because an OKR check-in should be about where did we start, what's the progress, why are we making more progress, for example? Like that's what an honest OKR check-in should be about. And this does not even have to be a separate meeting. You can do this as part of your sprint planning or your
Mhm.
review for that sake. So, and that's why I think there's this funny overlap. Like I agree with everything that he says. I just think there are different ways to address these points of criticism. You could turn it into a different way of setting goals and call it something different, or you could just quote unquote just modify the way you set OKRs.
I think what would be interesting, I'm trying to think about for our listeners, for example, if they are currently, well, if they're not using an OKR process, then there should be some form of goal setting that's happening and
Yeah,
ability to monitor towards that. So that's something to think about. But for those who are using an OKR style process, and then they do a retrospective, right? Say, okay, how did this go last quarter, and what's working, what's not working, and how should we potentially do things differently in the next
right.
round of OKR settings? Um, are there any like questions or hints that you would suggest people themselves? Because I think we talk about this a lot in our context series, that most of the people that we're talking to are highly skilled humans, right? People who get from
Right.
IC product management all the way up through leadership have typically done so by demonstrating their capacity and their growth and their ability. Um, but sometimes it's really hard to see from the inside what's going
Yeah.
on, and outside perspective is really helpful. So if there's somebody that's in this leadership role and they're trying to figure out how do I really, like, I can tell it's not clicking for my team, and,
Yeah.
what are some questions you might ask them to think about?
My favorite question is if we're following the retro, like, can you articulate the value you want the teams to get from using OKRs? Because I think it's difficult to do a retrospective if you can't anchor the retrospective in something where you actually want to go, right? It's like when you ask people, if you do like any like standard retrospective format, like a more or less start, stop, whatever it is, right? The question is, okay, I want to start doing that. I want to start doing this thing with OKRs. But the question should be, yeah, but why? Like, why should we do this differently with the OKRs? How does it help us? And then you suddenly realize, yeah, what do we want to achieve with OKRs? Do we
Mm-hmm.
want the teams to work more evidence-based? Do we want the teams to be more outcome-focused? Do we want a tighter alignment between company and teams priorities? I think that has to be clear. Like, what's the shift you're trying to create through OKRs? Like, seeing OKRs as a tool, as a change tool. And then you can have that. And then you can have the retrospective about, okay, what do you think is missing in our way we use OKRs so that we get the value we want to get from it? Because then the
Mm-hmm.
question becomes much more focused and much more framed rather than this generic, hey, what sucks about our OKRs? And then people love venting about OKRs and unloading all the ideas that they have. So I would invite people to make it specific about we want to get to it's almost like a vision for the way teams work, right? It's like think about what's the future stage look like? Where do we want to get to? And how is OKRs helping us doing that or not? And what do we have to change about it so that we get closer to it?
Right. I mean, for example, I was working with a company recently that realized they were going from like single product to platform, and they had platform teams and then app teams. And
Mm.
they were butting heads, right? Because you'd have a platform team trying to address the needs of this app team, but then this app team
Yeah.
wants something, and then they're going to go build it. Platform team, and so and the concept of shared objectives came up, right? Like really just
Hmm.
understanding how are you going to do air traffic control amongst these teams, and
Nice.
being able to point to a shared objective. And so that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that way, but in retrospect,
Yeah.
like thinking about, okay, well, the OKRs and objectives should be something that can be leveraged to improve velocity or reduce waste or
Yeah.
context switching and all those things that kind of hold teams back in their
Yeah.
productivity and such. So that's a really interesting angle. Um, and I like to say that because I have heard people complain a lot about the overhead of OKRs.
Yeah.
And I think the point would be that there is an investment to make, but if you're doing it right, it's going to help you get more out of the teams and the work that you're doing on a daily basis, right?
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And I think for me, it's always whenever I work with a larger company and larger, I mean, let's say they have like 15, 20 product teams, whatever. And like there was, for example, the situation where the company like felt like they didn't have a good alignment between company and product OKRs. And that, but they never had this formal conversation of looking at the product OKRs. It's like, yeah, so you only knew how the product team's OKRs look like sometime during the next quarter. Like there was never this moment
Hmm.
of alignment happening. It's like, okay, so maybe let's give that a try. And then if you just acknowledge the size of the company, it's like you can't speed that up. Like you can't speed it up further. It's like there is just a certain amount of time that these conversations take. And of course, the point is doing an OKR alignment. It's not about the OKRs. It's not about reading the
Hmm.
OKRs. It's about the conversation it enables. It's like, oh, you're
Hmm.
doing this thing. I also doing this thing. Like,
Hmm.
wow, we need to talk about it. Or I don't think you're missing a critical point in the OKRs you're focusing on. It's not about the OKRs because OKRs just should represent the measurable priorities of a team. So it's talking about
Hmm.
priorities. And I
Hmm.
think that's easy to forget that it's not the format. It's not the OKRs don't do something. OKRs just are a reflection of the way you operate already.
That's powerful. And then to that end, right, I think that sometimes I've felt as like a VP of product in an organization, but I've looked at other teams' OKRs. So when we're talking about operations or if we're talking about sales, right, that I see their OKRs and I'm thinking, well, wait, hold on. Like they can't achieve that OKR unless I fix the admin tool and have
Yeah.
it such that we can automate this piece, which, creates a lot of friction in the onboarding with our customer success people or
Hmm.
our account people, right? And that's operations, right? And then you have sales OKRs, which might have to do with, oh, we need better test demo environments that have redacted
Right.
data so that we can do those better. And so as a product leader, I've often felt, well, darn it, so much of even my cross-functional leaders' objectives have a dependency within the product
Hmm.
organization. Is that am I alone in that, or is that something that is pretty common? And how should we think
I
about that as product people?
I don't think you're alone in that. I will say that. I think for me, like that is one of the reasons why something like a company strategy or company OKRs can be beneficial, right? Because in order to somehow orchestrate this tension between different areas of the company, you need to have some kind of like overarching umbrella that makes a prioritization call,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. I think it's also important to acknowledge that one of the misconceptions that I see is that people confuse OKRs with the backlog or with KPIs, as in they think that it has to represent everything that they're doing. And I think it's a good reminder to say OKRs should be a representation of the things you're going to do differently, to come back to the earlier point that I make. Like, what are the things you're explicitly going to do differently, your priorities? I think it doesn't make sense trying to cover business as usual, maintenance, regular support work, and everything else in OKRs because then you have like 20 of them or whatever. Use them as like a sharp tool to make sure you make progress on the most important things. And then you can still debate, okay, maybe the sales team needs that. And maybe we do need you to do some work, but maybe the work isn't as substantial. And then maybe that's okay if it's not an OKRs. It's like a support work that we're going to do for the sales team, enablement work. Our big priority will be the integrations marketplace we're going to launch this quarter or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something important to make because otherwise, what will end up happening is that the sales team demands you have an OKR for them and your OKRs because that so this way they are sure that you do the work for them. This ends up to then OKRs becoming a reflection of everything, and they lose the power of being a focusing prioritization mechanic. And again, this is then not an OKR issue. It's more of an underlying trust and agreement issue that sales thinks, oh, you will only do it if you have it in your OKRs. And most larger companies will tell you there's all sorts of stuff going on outside of OKRs, which is normal because you can't predict, you can't predict and cover everything a team is doing in a
Mm.
quarter through OKRs. And I think you shouldn't.
So the OKRs, because sometimes they are thought to be a holistic um, approach where it's almost like, sometimes right, you have the company OKR, and then that trickles down to the division, the team, and then the human
Right.
even. Like, is there a level of granularity that you think tends to be
In
most
general,
useful as a cutoff? Yeah.
I think in general, the fewer levels, the better in general,
Yeah.
because every level adds a layer of effort, bureaucracy, process, and nobody needs more meetings and more processes and more chickens. So in
Yeah.
general, I think, yeah, like company and one level below, I think should be sufficient for most companies, most organizations. Of course, in some companies, let's say a department is so big that it could be its own company, and then I'm like, okay, by all means, maybe you do need a company OKR in between, but it has to be clear that this is more of an umbrella for the teams within that. It's not a very operational OKR because the department is 300 people. It's like you're not doing a check-in with 300 people every week. So in general, the fewer levels, the better. And start with the fewest levels possible. And you can always add more if you realize, oh, we have a problem. We need another layer, but don't add as many layers just because your org chart suggests it.
Right. Okay. And then what I'm hearing then is you have the OKRs, which are a little bit like the strategy. So you have the strategy, and then that informs the OKRs in terms of the kind of the operational plan for the strategy, I suppose. And then but separate from that, you have a backlog of all the things.
Yeah.
And those are really separate concepts that get managed in different ways.
I think they should be connected at least, right? But I think you're right as it flows. And of course, I think when you look at the type of work that you're doing from your backlog, there should be a healthy portion, and it's difficult to say exact share, but there should be a healthy portion of your backlog items which you can clearly connect to your OKRs.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it means you're not working on your most important stuff to advance your strategy, which is an issue.
Right.
And again,
Right.
OKRs just make that visible. It's not like that question should be present anyways. Like you should
Hmm.
focus on more important workforce strategy anyway already. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. That's one of the key things we'll hear from a lot of strategy people, including Marty Kagan, is that a lot of strategy is what you're choosing not to do, right? Because of what you're choosing to
Exactly.
focus on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how for product leaders that are listening and thinking, like, how are people deciding, oh, it's time for me to bring in some support here, right? To bring in
Mm.
a coach to support on
Yeah.
OKRs. Like, what's the most
Right.
common use case for that for you?
I think the most common use case is that they have what's the one most common use case? I think a common use case is that we have an existing OKR system, we have an existing way of using OKRs. We run into a set of the same complaints over and over again that make OKRs feel less valuable, and we want outside perspective on how to tackle these problems in our context, in our size. So maybe an experience on that. Um, the other one is that maybe they have an internal OKR function already, like sometimes that's called OKR champions, OKR masters, which is basically the people responsible for guiding the OKR drafting of a team. So taking on the moderation role. Maybe these people need an additional bit of inspiration so that the OKR drafting becomes focused on metrics and progress and not just needing have you fill out the OKR template. So I think
Hmm.
that's one part, like upskilling of people responsible for the OKR facilitation, so to speak. Maybe it is also, I mean, sometimes it's the case that uh, upper management doesn't listen to internal voices about how something should be adapted. Maybe an external voice is just more heard, for better or worse.
Hmm.
So that could be one reason. But I think really overarchingly, it's this um, we run into the same issues quarter over quarter, and we can't seem to see how we could fix them to get out of that rut. So that's how I would say is probably the
Hmm.
biggest one. So if like the results of your OKR retrospective feel like a never-ending story or like a cassette on repeat, you
Hmm.
might want to think about where do I get this additional input or perspectives from and how to approach these.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's a nice parallel for that for us with other conversations we've had around hiring coaching, right? And it's that again, when we have product leaders, and these are people that are entering into like head of product roles or VP product, or just that leadership role, they've gotten there through having great experience and skill and the ability, right? The ability to execute, the ability to lead. And I think oftentimes it takes a few times at bat to realize, okay, something in the equation here isn't, I know I'm not hitting the home run,
Yeah.
and I could use a little bit of a coach to figure out how to do that,
Yeah.
right? So I think
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
it's the same context here, right? Maybe you've been doing OKRs for a period or a quarter or two, and you're hearing grumblings about it from your team and concerns and starting to get feedback, and you're realizing, okay, let's be really intentional about
Yeah.
leveraging this for our teams and everything. Wow. Okay. That's a really great way to conclude our podcast today.
Yeah.
So thank you, Tim, so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Everybody will have Tim's information in the resources, but otherwise, how can people get a hold of you?
Easy ways on LinkedIn, just search for my name, and happy to reach out, connect with me there, or visit my website, herbig.co, and get in touch with that, or browse for the OKR resources there and let me know what you think of them.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me.
This podcast is an original production of Women in Product. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the Women in Product YouTube channel. Leave us a review so that others can discover us, or share this episode with someone you know. Original music provided by Jimmy Hahn. Thanks for joining.